The man in the third row had killed 11 people. He knew the exact number because he kept count. Not out of pride or guilt, but out of professional habit. A carpenter counts the houses he builds. A surgeon counts the lives he saves. Salvatore Bianchi counted the lives he ended. Tonight, if everything went according to plan, Dean Martin would be number 12. It was March 14, 1971. The Sands Hotel Copa Room was packed with over 2,000 people, all waiting for the King of Cool to take the stage. Sal had arrived early, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that hid the .38 revolver tucked into his waistband. He'd paid cash for his ticket. Front section, third row, aisle seat. Perfect sightline to the stage. Perfect escape route to the exit. He ordered a whiskey from the passing waitress and settled into his chair. Around him, couples laughed and clinked glasses. A woman in a red dress kept glancing at him, probably thinking he looked like someone important. If only she knew. Sal wasn't nervous. He was never nervous. That's what made him valuable to the Castellano family. Other hitmen got shaky hands, sweaty palms, racing hearts. Sal felt nothing. Just a calm, empty stillness that allowed him to do what needed to be done. The job had come through 3 days ago. A meeting in the back room of a Brooklyn restaurant with a man whose name Sal didn't know and didn't want to know. The man had slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a photograph of Dean Martin, a schedule of his Vegas performances, and $50,000 in cash. The other 50 would come after the job was done. Make it look random, the man had said. A crazy fan, a robbery gone wrong, whatever. Just make sure it can't be traced back. Sal had nodded. He didn't ask why. He never asked why. That wasn't his job. His job was the how, not the why. But sitting here now, watching the empty stage, Sal found himself wondering. Dean Martin wasn't a threat to anyone. He was a singer, an entertainer, a man who made people laugh. What could he possibly have done to deserve a $100,000 hit? The lights dimmed. The orchestra began to play. And Dean Martin walked onto the stage. The applause was thunderous. Dean smiled that lazy smile, waved casually at the crowd, and grabbed the microphone from the stand. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice warm and unhurried. "Welcome to the Sands. I'd tell you to sit back and relax, but looking at some of you, you've been relaxing since about noon." Laughter rippled through the room. Sal didn't laugh. He was studying Dean's movements, calculating angles, planning the moment. Between songs would be best. When Dean was standing still at center stage, basking in applause, one clean shot, then chaos, screaming, and Sal would slip out the side exit before anyone knew what happened. Dean launched into "Ain't That a Kick in the Head?" His voice was smooth, effortless, like honey poured over gravel. Sal had heard Dean Martin songs before, of course. Everyone had. But there was something different about hearing him live. Something that recordings couldn't capture. It was the presence. Dean Martin filled that stage like he owned it. Not with arrogance or showmanship, but with a kind of relaxed confidence that made you feel like you were in his living room, not a crowded casino showroom. He made 2,000 strangers feel like old friends. Sal shifted in his seat. His hand moved unconsciously toward his waistband, then stopped. Not yet. Too early. Wait for the right moment. Dean finished the song and the crowd erupted. He took a sip from a glass on the piano, probably apple juice made to look like bourbon. Sal had heard the drunk act was mostly fake, and smiled at the audience. "You know, I love playing Vegas," Dean said. "Where else can you lose your money, your dignity, and your wife all in the same night, sometimes to the same dealer?" More laughter. Dean's eyes scanned the crowd, connecting with faces here and there, making each person feel seen. For just a moment, his gaze passed over Sal, and something strange happened. Sal felt it, a flicker of something in his chest. Not fear, not guilt, just recognition. Like Dean Martin had looked right through him and seen something. It was ridiculous, of course. Dean was just working the room, doing what performers do. He couldn't possibly know what Sal was there for, but the feeling lingered. Dean started his next song, Everybody Loves Somebody. The orchestra swelled. Couples in the audience reached for each other's hands, and Sal Bianchi, professional killer, found himself listening to the words. Everybody loves somebody sometime. When had anyone loved him? Sal tried to remember. His mother, maybe, before she died when he was 12. His wife, Maria, perhaps, in the early years before she figured out what he really did for a living and took their daughter to California. He hadn't seen either of them in 6 years. Everybody falls in love somehow. The song continued, and Sal felt something cracking inside him. Something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. He thought about his daughter, Rosa. She'd be 14 now. Did she even remember his face? Did she know what her father had become? He thought about the 11 people he'd killed. Most of them deserved it, at least by the standards of the world he lived in. Informants, traitors, men who'd broken the code. But there had been others. A witness who'd simply been in the wrong place. A girlfriend who'd heard too much. Their faces visited him sometimes in the moments before sleep. Everybody finds somebody someplace. Sal's hand moved to his waistband again. His fingers touched the cold metal of the revolver. This was the moment. Dean was standing still, the audience was captivated, and nobody was watching the man in the third row. He could do it right now. One shot, then pandemonium. He'd killed men from farther away than this. Dean Martin would be dead before he hit the ground. But his hand didn't move. The song ended. The applause washed over the room like a wave. Dean bowed slightly, that humble gesture that somehow managed to seem both gracious and ironic at the same time. Thank you, Dean said. You're too kind. Or too drunk. Either way, I appreciate it. He launched into a comedy routine. Jokes about marriage, about drinking, about Frank Sinatra's ego. The audience howled. Even Sal found himself smiling, just slightly, just for a second, before he caught himself. What was happening to him? He'd done jobs like this dozens of times. Walk in, pull the trigger, walk out. Clean, professional, emotionless. That was the Sal Bianchi way. That was why he was worth $100,000. But something about tonight was different. Something about this man on stage, this singer with the sleepy eyes and the easy laugh, was getting through the armor Sal had spent decades building. Maybe it was the way Dean talked about his family between songs. His kids, his ex-wives, his mother back in Ohio. The way his voice softened when he mentioned them, like they were the only real things in a world of showbiz fakery. Maybe it was the loneliness Sal recognized in Dean's eyes. Despite the crowd, despite the laughter, despite the fame, Dean Martin looked like the loneliest man in the world, and Sal understood loneliness. He lived in it. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Sal was just tired. Tired of the blood, the lies, the empty hotel rooms. Tired of being number 12's last sight on earth. Dean was singing again. You're nobody till somebody loves you. And Sal made a decision. He stood up. The woman in the red dress glanced at him curiously. A few other people turned their heads as he squeezed past them toward the aisle. Sal ignored them all. He walked toward the exit, his hand leaving his waistband, the revolver still unfired. He was almost at the door when he heard Dean's voice cut through the music. Hey, pal. Where you going? Show's not over yet. Sal froze. The audience laughed, assuming it was part of the act. But Dean's eyes were locked on him, and there was something in them that wasn't part of any performance. Come on, Dean said, gesturing with his microphone. You paid good money for that seat. Least you could do is let me finish boring you. More laughter from the crowd. But Sal heard something else in Dean's voice. A genuine invitation. Maybe even a challenge. Against every instinct, against every rule he'd ever followed, Sal turned around. He walked back to his seat. He sat down. Dean watched him the whole time. Then he smiled. Not the showman's smile, but something smaller, more private, and went back to his song. Sal stayed for the rest of the show. 2 hours later, the Copa Room had emptied. Sal should have been on a plane back to New York by now. Instead, he was sitting at the bar, nursing his third whiskey, staring at his reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. He'd failed. For the first time in his career, he'd been given a job and hadn't completed it. The people who'd hired him wouldn't be happy. There would be consequences. Sal knew how this world worked. You don't walk away from a contract. But he couldn't do it. He'd sat in that audience for 2 hours, watching Dean Martin sing and joke and connect with thousands of strangers, and he couldn't pull the trigger. Something about that man had reached inside him and touched whatever humanity he had left. That seat taken? Sal looked up. Dean Martin was standing next to him, still in his tuxedo, a cigarette dangling from his lips. Up close, he looked older than he did on stage. Tired. Human. "Help yourself," Sal said. Dean sat down and signaled the bartender. "Bourbon. The good stuff, not the prop juice." He turned to Sal. "You're the guy who almost walked out." "Yeah. But you came back." "Yeah." Dean studied him for a moment. Those sleepy eyes weren't sleepy at all, Sal realized. They were watchful, calculating. This man saw more than he let on. "You know," Dean said, "I've been doing this for 30 years. I can read a room pretty well. And when you walked in tonight, I knew something was off." Sal's hand twitched involuntarily. "Off how?" "You weren't there to enjoy yourself. You were there for business." Dean accepted his bourbon from the bartender and took a slow sip. "I grew up in Steubenville, Ohio. You know what kind of town that was? My father cut hair in a shop that was a front for the numbers racket. I've known men like you my whole life." Sal said nothing. His mind was racing. Did Dean know? Had he recognized the threat? Was this some kind of trap? "Relax," Dean said, as if reading his thoughts. "I'm not wearing a wire. I'm not setting you up. I just wanted to talk to the guy who sat through my whole show looking like he was solving a math problem instead of having a good time." "What do you want?" Dean shrugged. "Nothing. I'm curious, that's all. You came here to do something. Then you didn't do it. What changed?" Sal was quiet for a long moment. The noise of the casino drifted in from outside. Slot machines, laughter, the endless churn of money and hope. In here at the bar, it was just two men and a question that shouldn't be answered. "Your song," Sal said finally. "The one about everybody loving somebody." Dean raised an eyebrow. "That's what stopped you? A love song?" "My daughter used to sing that song when she was little. She had a terrible voice, but she loved that song." Sal took a drink. "I haven't seen her in 6 years." Dean nodded slowly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. "I've done things," Sal continued, not sure why he was talking but unable to stop. "Things that can't be forgiven. I told myself they were just business, just the job. But sitting there tonight, listening to you sing, I saw my daughter's face. I saw my wife's face. I saw everyone I've ever—" He stopped. The word caught in his throat. "Lost?" Dean offered quietly. "Hurt." They sat in silence for a while. Dean finished his bourbon and ordered another. The bartender refilled Sal's glass without being asked. "I don't know what you were here to do tonight," Dean said eventually. "I don't want to know. But you didn't do it. That counts for something." "Does it?" "It's a start." Dean turned to face him. "You got a choice now. You can go back to whoever sent you, tell them whatever story you need to tell. Or you can walk away. Disappear. Find your daughter. Try to remember who you were before you became this. It's not that simple." "Nothing ever is. But that doesn't mean you don't try." Sal stared at his drink. The amber liquid reflected the bar lights like liquid fire. His whole life had led to this moment. A conversation with a stranger who should have been his victim, who was instead offering him something that felt dangerously like hope. "Why do you care?" he asked. Dean smiled, and for once it wasn't the performer's smile. It was something sadder, more personal. "Because I know what it's like to wear a mask, to pretend you're something you're not, to be so deep in the act that you forget there's a real person underneath." He paused. "I also know what it's like to lose people you love because you were too busy being someone else. You're Dean Martin. You have everything." "I have a lot of things. But everything?" Dean shook his head. "I've got 3 ex-wives who can't stand me, kids who grew up with a stranger, more money than I'll ever spend and nobody to spend it with. I go home every night to an empty house and watch old westerns until I fall asleep." He turned back to the bar, staring at his own reflection. "You want to know the truth? I'm the loneliest man in Las Vegas, maybe in the world. The only time I feel alive is on that stage, making strangers laugh, and even that's starting to feel like a prison." Sal didn't know what to say. He'd come here to kill this man. Now he was hearing confessions that felt more honest than anything he'd heard in years. "So when I see someone else trapped," Dean continued, "someone else wearing a mask they can't take off, I recognize it. And I figure, maybe if I can't save myself, I can at least point someone else toward the exit." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cocktail napkin, grabbed a pen from the bartender and scribbled something on it. "There's a guy I know," Dean said, sliding the napkin toward Sal. "He helps people disappear. New identity, new life, the whole thing. No questions asked. Tell him I sent you." Sal looked at the napkin. A name and a phone number. A lifeline he'd never expected. "Why would you help me? You don't even know what I was here to do." Dean stood up and put some bills on the bar. He looked at Sal one last time. "I know exactly what you were here to do, pal. I've been around long enough to recognize a gun under a jacket. But I also recognize something else. That moment when you walked out. That moment when you came back." He paused. "That was you, deciding who you want to be. The real you, not the mask." He started to walk away, then stopped. "Your daughter," he said without turning around. "What's her name?" "Rosa." Dean nodded. "Find Rosa. That's all that matters. Everything else is just noise." And then he was gone, disappearing into the casino crowd like a ghost in a tuxedo. Sal sat at the bar for another hour, staring at the napkin. The name and number that could change everything. The exit door that Dean Martin had opened. He thought about the $100,000 he'd never collect. The people in Brooklyn who would come looking for him. The danger that waited on every path. And he thought about Rosa. 14 years old now. Growing up without a father. Not knowing that her dad had spent the last decade becoming a monster. At midnight, Sal Bianchi made a phone call. Not to Brooklyn, to the number on the napkin. 3 days later, he was on a bus to California with a new name and an old photograph of his daughter. He never saw Dean Martin again. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, he would sit in whatever small apartment he was living in and listen to Everybody Loves Somebody on the radio. And sometimes when the song ended, he would call his daughter, his Rosa, who'd forgiven him after years of trying, who'd let him back into her life piece by piece, and tell her he loved her. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day, 1995. Sal read about it in a newspaper. He sat alone in his living room in San Diego and cried for the first time in decades. Not for the singer, not for the legend, for the man who'd looked at a killer and seen a human being, for the man who'd given him a second chance with nothing but a song and a cocktail napkin. Sal Bianchi lived another 12 years. He died in 2007, surrounded by his daughter's family, a grandfather who'd spent his final chapter trying to make amends. On his nightstand, worn and faded but carefully preserved, was a cocktail napkin from the Sands Hotel. The ink had faded years ago, but Sal had memorized the number anyway. It was the number that had saved his life. And in his wallet, tucked behind his driver's license, was a photograph he'd cut from a magazine in 1971. Dean Martin on stage, microphone in hand, that famous smile on his face. On the back, in Sal's shaky handwriting, were 3 words: He saw me.